Well, welcome to this series of lectures on the book of Samuel. My name's Paul Evans, and I'm so glad you're virtually joining me as we read the book of Samuel together. And what a book it is. You know, they say a masterpiece is something that moves people intensely, and a masterpiece is recognized widely for its brilliance in art. A lot of people talk about Mozart's Requiem, or maybe Homer's Odyssey, the Sistine Chapel, or U2's The Joshua Tree. Well, my bias might be showing there a little bit, but masterpieces are appreciated for their brilliance and recognized and acknowledged over a long span of time. Well, the book of Samuel is like that. Famous literary critic Robert Alter calls Samuel, quote, one of the most astounding pieces of narrative that has come down to us from the ancient world. He says, it's the greatest single narrative representation in antiquity of a human life evolving by slow stages through time, shaped and altered by the pressures of political life, public institutions, family, the impulses of body and spirit, and the eventual sad decay of the flesh. It also provides the most unflinching insight into the cruel processes of history and into human behavior warped by the pursuit of power. Well, the book of Samuel is one of the greatest literary works in human history, in my opinion. Its masterfully told stories, I think, capture the imagination of readers, and they have done so for millennia. You have Hannah's heartfelt pleadings for a child, the fall of the Elide house, the calling of young Samuel and his establishment as a prophet without peer, the young shepherd boy, David, his musical talent, his defeat of the giant, the manic king, Saul, and his fall from grace and his eerie visit to a witch in Endor, David's adultery with Bathsheba and the cunning murder of her husband, and the sad decline of David's fortunes and tragic family deaths and turmoil. Well, the story is laced with high drama, intrigue, theological insight, and mystery. And of course, the book is more than a great literary work. It's also a historical account of individuals and a nation. And even more than this, Samuel is scripture, and it was written to teach its reader about God and his workings in the world, both in the past in ancient Israel, as well as the future with the coming of Jesus Christ to fulfill the Davidic promises. So the book of Samuel is part in the Christian ordering of the Old Testament. Its place in the canon is it's part of a section called the historical books, which includes Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. They're called this because the church believed it gave them an account of Israel's history. In the Hebrew ordering of the Old Testament, Samuel is part of a section called the former prophets, which includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And the latter prophets are those books that we usually think of as prophetic, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets. But the books of Joshua to Kings are seen as prophetic nonetheless. Now, they include prophecies, as we'll see early in the story, like they prophesy the end of the Elide line, the rise of a new priest to the priesthood. They also fulfill prophecies, like Jacob's prophecy in Genesis that Judah would rule Israel, Deuteronomy's prediction that Israel will one day ask for a human king, and the fulfillment of the prophecy to Abraham that his line would bear kings. So, though 1st and 2nd Samuel are two books in modern Bibles, they're originally one book, and it's part of the former prophets. The reason we broke it into two books is, well, scribes usually use scrolls of approximately the same length. And so when it was translated from Hebrew to Greek, a single scroll was not long enough to account for the whole book of Samuel. So it was divided into two books in the Greek translation, which is called the Septuagint, or sometimes known as the LXX. The Septuagint named the books 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, or reigns, with what we now know as 1st and 2nd Kings being 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, or reigns. The Hebrew book of Samuel was actually only divided into two books in AD 1517 with the first rabbinic Bible. And eventually this became the norm. So really it's one book. Well, who wrote the book of Samuel? Well, the name Samuel for the book can cause a little bit of confusion. You know, we're used to books being named after their author in a lot of instances. And we think of books in the Old Testament like some of those prophetic books, Jeremiah, etc. But the prophet Samuel actually dies in the first half of the book, in 1 Samuel 25. So he obviously didn't write 2 Samuel at least. And most likely didn't write 1 Samuel even. The book may have been named after him, though, because, well, he's the first main character in the book. He's clearly a significant figure in Israelite history. And his ministry forms kind of a transition from the era of judges to the kings. So Samuel is kind of this, he uniquely served as a judge, a priest, and a prophet. Kind of had three roles. And after Samuel, others didn't really multitask in this way. He's kind of a unique figure. Later, prophets were prophets, priests were priests, largely. Samuel's prophecies and actions also set out the plan for the whole book and what follows. Samuel anointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. Samuel expounds on the role and character of kingship in 1 Samuel 12. And Samuel prophetically announced the end to Saul's kingship and God's special choosing of David as his king in 1 Samuel 13:14. So naming the book after Samuel is appropriate. But if Samuel didn't write it, who did? Well, like many other Old Testament books, the book of Samuel is actually anonymous. Some early Jewish tradition held several prophets contemporary with the events that transpire in the book wrote it. Well, whoever wrote them, they were definitely inspired by God's Spirit, and in that sense, it's prophetic. The author used other sources. Samuel itself talks about the book of Yashar as a written source in 2 Samuel 1:18. Administrative lists that are included in the story seem to reflect relying on a written source of some sort. And the end of 2 Samuel seems to rely on other materials, kind of appendices in 2 Samuel 21-24 that kind of are included at the end, but probably occurred earlier in the story. So the exact demarcation of different sources in Samuel is something scholars love to debate. If you look through academic scholarship, you'll see all sorts of debates about what the previous sources were. But it's pretty clear a later author used a variety of older sources, even if we can't figure out exactly what they were. And they wrote the book, even if most of these sources aren't available to us. So when was the book of Samuel written? Well, Samuel was part of a larger continuous storyline recounting the history of Israel. And it starts when Israel is entering the land in Joshua, and then goes until they're expelled from the land at the end of 2 Kings. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Together, these books form a grand connected narrative of Israel's history. And it evaluates that history in light of what Deuteronomy says, the teachings and theology of Deuteronomy. There's lots of similarities in the language in Deuteronomy and in these historical books, and a lot of similarities in theme. And for this reason, scholars often talk about Joshua to 2 Kings as the Deuteronomistic history or the Deuteronomic history. So they think the author wrote this in light of Deuteronomy. The occasion for the writing of this history was the exile, the traumatic experience of the Babylonian exile, when much of the population of Judah was taken to Babylon after Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. So this beleaguered exilic community had a crisis of faith in exile. They wrestled with all sorts of fundamental questions. I mean, how could this happen? Why were they in exile? What about God's promises to David and the patriarchs? What does this mean for their faith, their religion? What does this mean about their God? Well, during this crisis of faith, God inspired the author of Joshua to 2 Kings to compose an epic narrating Israel's story. Though the author is anonymous, sometimes scholars refer to him as the Deuteronomist, or DTR for short. So they don't think that's his real name, but just to refer to this anonymous author, because the history he compiled was informed by the theology of Deuteronomy. The history as a whole answers questions that community living in exile would have had, and they answer the questions based on Deuteronomy's theology. They're told the exile occurs because they disobeyed God's covenant. God's promises haven't failed, but the people have failed. Israel's kings failed. If you go forward in the story and read, especially 1 and 2 Kings, you'll see that most of those kings continually fail and break the covenant. And we'll see even in 1 and 2 Samuel. And God, though, they may be questioning what happened to their God, what about their faith? But God is true to his word, and he will bring his eternal covenant to fulfillment. So trying to come up with a date for when this book was finished It's most likely was finished with this larger history of Joshua to Kings. So the final composition of the book of Samuel is during the exile. The end of the larger story, the end of 2 Kings, concludes with Jerusalem being destroyed in 586 and the beginning of the Babylonian exile. The last narrated event at the end of 2 Kings, in 2 Kings 25, was where the king Jehoiakim was freed to eat with the Babylonian king. He was brought up from prison, allowed to eat at the king's table. And that dates to around 560 BC. So the book of Kings, as we know it, would not have been composed prior to those events because it narrates it. And it's unlikely that Kings was written after the exile because it doesn't talk about any return from exile, which probably would have done so if they had already returned. So this means the date of the final composition dates to around 560 to 539 BC. And it's the period when Judah was in Babylonian exile. And they had all these questions, and they're writing to that audience to explain their situation. So the book of Samuel was compiled as part of this history. It was likely completed during this time, even though it relied on earlier writings. So what type of literature is Samuel? Well, in interpreting any biblical book, it's important to determine what genre the book is. You know, whenever you read anything, you have to answer basic questions about the literary form. You may not even realize it, but intuitively have some guiding thoughts in mind when you start to read something. You know, do you read a math textbook the same way you read a poem? Of course not. You kind of intuitively know what type of genre you're dealing with. For example, when you open a book, do you read it by assuming that all of its data are accurate? Maybe like a math formula or user manual? Or do you approach this text you're reading with a healthy skepticism, like the way you would read an advertisement for cars, diets, or clothes? Or do you grant this text great poetic and artistic license, maybe the way you approach poetry or fantasy literature? Well, take this paragraph I'm about to read. Does this sound kind of strange? Listen to this. What genre would this be? The stars will fall from heaven. The sun will cease its shining. The moon will be turned to blood, and fire mingled with hail will fall from the heavens. And the rest of the country will have sunny intervals and scattered showers. Well, I always find that funny because it's a mix of genres, and that's why it sounds funny. At first it sounds apocalyptic and scary, end of the world, and then in the end it's a weather forecast. But you pick that up because you instantly can tell, oh, we've switched genres midway. So it's important to understand the type of book that you're reading. You know, when you read the Psalms and it says, God is my rock, we know it's poetry. We don't think the author is saying God is an inanimate object, a sedimentary object. No, it's metaphorical. We don't want to misread Samuel now by assuming it's just poetry. We'd misunderstand it. So what is Samuel? What kind of literature? Well, Samuel is what we would call ancient historiography. A clear purpose of the book of Samuel is to depict and interpret historical events. However, since the literary genre of history in the modern sense doesn't exist in the ancient world, we have to be careful calling it history. It's not the same as we'd write history today. Furthermore, the English word history can be kind of ambiguous and can mean either events of the past as history or a verbal account of these events, written history. So for clarity, I think it's better to use the word historiography to talk about verbal accounts of the past and history to what actually happened. But ancient historiography, like the book of Samuel, played by different rules than modern historiography. Modern historiography is strictly chronological and aims to be exact in its recounting of facts and events. Rather than adhering to a strict chronology, ancient historiography, kind of like Greek historiography, was often organized differently, thematically maybe, instead of following a strict chronological order. Ancient historiography often used genealogies, speeches, or narrative formulas as structuring devices, rather than a strict chronology. Also, the speeches that are represented in these texts are largely the creative work of an historian, rather than being drawn from transcripts in their sources. Also, both the overall content and particular details of the narrative were subject to the historian's interpretation of the events. Well, the same historical method can be seen in Samuel. For example, 1 Samuel 29 to 30 is actually out of chronological order. 1 Samuel 28, 3 to 25 are kind of like a flashback, like you might get in a narrative in a movie, in a novel. 1 Samuel 29 begins with David marching out with the Philistines on their way to Jezreel, which is where the Philistine army is in 1 Samuel 28, the chapter before. Further, in the last chapter, Samuel predicted that Saul would die the next day, but several days are actually narrated in the story before that happens, because there's this flashback there. As well, the events of 2 Samuel 21, near the end of the story, and the Gibeonites slaying Saul's sons, this seems to have taken place before Absalom's rebellion in 2 Samuel 15 to 18. And we see that when Shimei curses David, and it seems to assume David is responsible for the death of these Saul lines. Similarly, the story of David's census in 2 Samuel 24 took place at an unknown time, but probably earlier in David's reign. Another thing that separates ancient historiography from modern history writing is that modern history writing is concerned with just the facts. Just the facts, man. That's all it wants. It wants to be objective. Commenting on the meaning of history is not really acceptable anymore. But in ancient historiography, commenting on the meaning of history was the whole point to telling the story. It is shamelessly subjective. It does not strive to be objective. And it wants to talk about God's involvement in history. Modern historiography doesn't let there be any place for God or the gods to affect human history. The historical critical method forbids it. Historical causation can only be attributed to natural factors, according to modern methodologies. There's no room for the supernatural. But ancient historiography included the supernatural. In fact, the point to the history is often tied up with acknowledging God or gods in other instances. This is often more important than chronology. It's more important than relaying events exactly as they happen. The ultimate explanation for historical events is God and his providential mastery of history. Ancient historiography is also selective. The book of Samuel records historical events, but it doesn't write them like modern history would. It feels free to omit details that modern history is very concerned with. For example, 2 Kings 15:37 records an attack against Judah by foreign kings, but the author doesn't describe any reasons for the attack other than saying, quote, "In those days the Lord began to send Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, against Judah." But what were the reasons for the attack? What were the political reasons? What was the king trying to do? The author doesn't comment on these reasons. Instead, he just gives a theological interpretation to explain it. We see this in Samuel too. In 2 Samuel 8, King Toi of Hamath brings gifts to David. What was his angle? What was his political angle? What was he hoping to accomplish? We are told it was to congratulate David and that David put the gifts in the temple, but what was that king up to politically? The Bible doesn't comment on that. This is what a modern historiographer would want to know, but the ancient Israelite historiographer wants to show Yahweh was bringing David success and fame. So that's the point. Other reasons, although they would have existed in history, are ignored. So the main purpose of biblical historiography is to teach a theological message. In fact, theological reasons for past events and their relevance for the present and future are what characterize biblical historiography. That's the whole point. God is the whole point to history. So it's ancient historiography, and it's written differently than modern history writing in that it uses a lot of narrative art. An author of ancient historiography engaged in research, gathering information from oral and written sources, and recorded its findings. So that's what sets it apart from it being just a storyteller or something like that. But ancient historiography was closer to storytelling than modern history writing. Biblical historiography is written in a style closer to narrative fiction than modern history writing allows. So it uses narrative tools like suspense, plot, characterization, and it uses all this to talk about the past. So you can think of historiography as kind of like a painting. It seeks to represent the subject in the painting. It's not a fictional portrayal, but it's not a photograph. It uses narrative methods to represent its story. You know, a picture could be really contrived. You know, you might have a painting of someone. It might include things in the portrait that might tell us something about what the person was like. So the picture could be someone sitting at a piano because they played piano. On top of the piano might be their Xbox because they love gaming. There might be a Bible sitting beside them. There might be a basketball sitting there. It seems kind of contrived. Who keeps their Xbox sitting on a piano? It's got to be connected to a TV. But they put all this together to give you a picture of what that person is like. So in one sense, it's fictional, but in another sense, it's telling you more about the person than an actual photo might, a selfie they might take. So in some ways, biblical historiography is kind of like that. It's representational art. Although it's constrained by historical facts, it's not fiction, it is an artistic representation of events, similar to how a painting represents reality. Like a painting, the closer you look at a painting, the more you start to see the brushstrokes. Even in a very realistic painting, the closer you get, you'll start to see this is a painting, not a photo. Well, the closer you look at the narrative in Samuel, even though it represents historically what happened, the closer you get, you see the brushstrokes of narrative elements that are used to construct the picture. So the historiographer uses narrative elements like plot, where action builds, rises, there's a climax, there's some resolution. Characterization, where characters can be, sometimes a narrator might comment on what a character is like, but many times you have to actually determine what type of character this is by what they're saying, what another character says about them, or their actions. And that can tell us what the character is really like. In this type of literature, the writer wants the reader to draw conclusions based on these types of characterization. The writer also uses keywords sometimes purposely to make a theological point in the story, where the same word or word root sometimes is repeated throughout a story, and it kind of tunes you in that there's a theme here, there's something important it's pointing to. They're not guided by the goal of being exact, but with communicating a theme or theological point to the story. The narrative tools are used to help the reader get the theological point to the story. But the brushstrokes don't mean it's inaccurate. The painting gives a good representation of its subject, even if the Xbox on the piano is unlikely. But it tells us more about the subject than even just a photograph might in another instance. The book of Samuel gives a good representation of its subject. Through its genre of historiography that used the brush of narrative tools to paint its subject, it represents history well. Samuel, as an ancient apology, is another way that many people have looked at these books. In the ancient world, there were apologies written to defend famous figures from criticism. Not an apology as I'm sorry, but from the Greek, meaning a defense or a justification. Apologetic literature from the ancient Near East defended its subject from charges that, for instance, a king came to the throne illegitimately. He usurped the throne, or he killed off the previous king or the royal heirs, and he unlawfully became king. An example from the ancient Near East is the Hittite apology of Hattusili III. It defends him from charges that he usurped the throne. So it tries to show that he was a good leader because he had early military success. He was a trusted commander. He also was very popular and had support among the people. It also emphasizes that he used restraint in waging the struggle that led to his taking the throne. And his succession to the throne was not part of his grand scheme to take out the other king. He was blameless in all the dealings with his predecessor, even though his predecessor was jealous of him. So his rise to the throne was also attributed to the special favor of the goddess Ishtar. The book of Samuel may have originally been written as an apology as well, or at least parts of it. And it was written to defend David from actual or possible charges leveled against him. Maybe those who supported the Saulite dynasty. So David and his line may have been charged with usurping the throne illegitimately. And they would have argued that David ambitiously advanced himself in Israel at the expense of Saul. They would have argued David was a deserter. He left Saul's court. He was disloyal. He joined with the enemy, the Philistines. David was an outlaw. He led a pack of rebels against the state. And David had a hand in the death of Saul, Abner, his general later, and Ishbosheth, Saul's son. As you read the David story, it's easy to see how these kinds of charges might have arisen, given what happened. But Samuel, as an apology, defends David of these charges. It shows David was widely popular among the people, and it shows his early military success. Defeats Goliath. He fought on behalf of Israel. He showed his loyalty and ability to serve the king and serve Saul. David did not attempt to take the throne by force. David showed great restraint against Saul and was blameless in his dealings with him. David's band of men made no moves against Saul, but functioned only defensively and fought for Israel's benefit. David only fled to Philistia because Saul was out to kill him. David was never loyal to the Philistines, but covertly used his position there to help Israel. And it really emphasizes David played no part in the deaths of Saul and his children, or Abner, his general. But instead, he punished those who killed them. And David's ascension to the throne was Yahweh's doing. Samuel's story of David's rise to the throne may have originally functioned apologetically. But this doesn't mean that the reader should not trust the story. While they may have been written from their own perspective, they emphasize David's innocence in his rise to the kingship, they're not for that reason false. They're not out to give us a false story of David. Actually, David is not whitewashed in any way in the story. David is portrayed in a multifaceted way from the very beginning. David's flaws are not hidden from view, even early in the story. So in this lecture series, we'll read the book of Samuel. We'll read it as ancient historiography. We'll consider it an artfully told story, noticing characterization, plot developments, that kind of thing. We'll notice its apologetic character, how it defends David. But we also need to read it in the context of a larger story. As we read the book together, we need to have an overview of the larger story. So the book of Samuel follows the books of Judges and Ruth, as we've seen, but not only in canonical order, but in historical context. So 1 Samuel 1 begins noting its story is taking place during the period of the Judges. During this time, Israel had no human king. It's what scholars call a theocracy. God was their king. Israel had great leaders, Moses, Joshua, but they didn't have a human king. After settling in the Promised Land, Israel was led by various judges who God would raise up in Israel in a time of need. During the period of the Judges, Israel struggled with faithfulness to God. They struggled with their faith. They cycled through intervals of going after foreign gods and being oppressed by foreigners, calling on God and God delivering them by sending them some chosen judges. As the period of the Judges continues, things actually get worse. You see in the book of Judges, things seem to get worse. At first, the judges were really faithful. They fulfilled their calling, like Othniel in Judges 3. But later judges were less pious and less successful. Samson seems apparently unaware of his calling and spends most of his time chasing women, if you read his story. Well, the book of Judges concludes with the notable absence of any judge, and it narrates some terrible events that take place. Judges 19 talks about how there's a gang rape and murder of the Levite's concubine, which leads to the near slaughter of an entire tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, in Judges 20. And then to save Benjamin, they abduct a bunch of virgins from Shiloh to force them into marrying the survivors. It's pretty horrible things. In fact, one of the main purposes of the book of Judges seems to be to show that Israel needed a human king. A key phrase that's repeated in the book of Judges is, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit, or some translations say, what was right in their own eyes. We see this in Judges 17:6, 21:25, and elsewhere. With these phrases, the book is emphasizing Israel needs a king. Look at how bad things were without a king. So the book sets the stage for the creation of Israel's monarchy and the introduction of Israel's last judge, Samuel. So when the book starts, there's no king in Israel, despite the obvious need for one. Hopefully this opening lecture will help orientate you to the type of literature we find in Samuel, and also help situate where in the larger story the events of Samuel take place. I'm excited to go through the book with you, and we'll begin reading it in the next lecture.